Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, the show that takes you down a rabbit hole, abandons you. You get beat up. We don't care. Stacey.
Max, we are in Washington, D.C. because we are refugees from Hurricane Florence, which is hitting North Carolina, where we normally reside and do this show. But here we are in Washington, D.C. The swamp is truly drained here because it seems everybody else has left town for fear of Hurricane Florence. It is also the 10-year anniversary of the great financial crisis and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which many in the mainstream media say that set it all off, but really it all started before then, the financial crisis. I want to look at an op-ed that the New York Times published on behalf of Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, and Timothy Geithner. Remember when Lehman Brothers collapsed, Timothy Geithner was the head of the New York Fed, which is really the Federal Reserve Bank of America. Ben Bernanke was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, and Hank Paulson was the Treasury Secretary. And they let Lehman collapse and then came to the rescue of all their friends. Well, they wrote an op-ed about basically concern trolling that there could be another financial crisis, and first pointing out how much they, as Federal Reserve Bank chairman and people involved in that, helped rescue the system back then. They said, although we and other financial regulators did not foresee the crisis, the Keiser Report foresaw the crisis, I might add, we moved aggressively to stop it. Acting in its traditional role as lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve provided massive quantities of short-term loans to financial institutions facing runs while cutting interest rates nearly to zero. The Treasury Department stopped a run on money market funds by providing a backstop for investors. The Treasury also managed to take over the mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and worked with the Fed to try to prevent the collapse of large, systemically important financial firms. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guaranteed bank debt and protected depositors. By the way, the title of this op-ed is called What We Need to Fight the Next Financial Crisis.
Right. Well, the key phrase there is a run on money market. So in a functioning economy, there's no such thing as a run on a money market. You have trade, you have business, you have an economy, and it's a zero-sum game. Unless there's something amiss, unless you have a bad actor who is issuing uncollateralized receipts into the economy, unless you have a bad actor that's printing bogus claims that cause bogus trading, that cause huge wealth concentrations and corruption of power by being funded by these bogus claims. That bad actor would be the Federal Reserve. Those bogus claims would be the U.S. dollar. The enabler would be Obama's friend, Timothy Geithner. The enabler would be one of the biggest crooks of the century, Ben Bernanke. They are worried that if there is another crisis, their paper claims, uncollateralized, unbacked Ponzi scheme that is the U.S. dollar and the U.S. government will be forced to make good on these false claims that they print by. There's 37 billion paper receipts, bills, are printed every day. 37 billion bills, dollars, $5 bills, $10 bills, $20 bills, $100 bills. 37 billion of those are printed every day. There's no backing. There's no collateral. They're IOUs against a system that has 22 or 21, 22 trillion in debt, not including the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. That would give it 150 trillion in debt.
Yeah, but let's go back to the 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of Lehman Brothers. One thing, you mentioned the uncollateralized part. The ordinary American does get blamed for it, the subprime borrower. But in fact, if it had just been the subprime borrowing, and Eve Smith, who wrote Econ, and she has nakedcapitalism.com, pointed out that it wasn't that. Had it just been those mortgages, those subprime mortgages defaulting in a normal banking system, in a normal financial system, that would have just caused a hit similar to the savings and loan crisis. A little bit worse, but contained. What really happened were the CDS and all the basically the paper claims on top of it. So Wall Street had created 4 to 5 times the economy of the United States in short positions and synthetic shorts.
Well, you mentioned the savings and loan crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, so the savings and loan crisis was an example of paper claims being created that had no way of being covered. It was a counterfeiting scheme, a Ponzi scheme where John McCain Rest
Yes,
his soul.
we talked about this 2 weeks ago.
Okay, so 1,500 bankers went to jail.
Yeah.
Because they committed fraud. Yeah. Now, what happened after the savings and loan crisis is banking reform.
Yes.
And what used to be illegal, printing fraudulent paper claims, was made legal.
Yes.
Which gave us the 2008 crisis.
Yes.
It was a repeat, 4 times bigger.
Okay.
But nobody went to jail.
Nobody went to jail.
Okay. So Thanks, Barack Obama.
Yeah.
You crook.
No. Okay, we're going to go into that because right now resistance is celebrated, and there's like an anonymous person in the White House who's releasing resistance op-eds also to the New York Times. But there's also another recent piece. We're not going to go into that, but people should look it up. And it's talking about the resistance that was in the White House under Obama, and that was Timothy Geithner, because he moved from the New York Fed to the Treasury, and he was in the Obama White House. And in March of 2009, Barack Obama did finally, he was resistant to this, but he did finally approve the breakup of Citibank. Not many people know this, but in fact, what happened is Timothy Geithner slow-walked it. He didn't want to break up Citibank. He wanted to rescue his friends on Wall Street, and in fact, he was the resistance within the White House, and he did not break up Citibank. Instead, we have what we have today. But he and Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke, and Hank Paulson wrote this op-ed in the New York Times, and basically what they're saying that is the problem right now is when this next financial crisis hits, Congress has removed the power for unlimited bailouts. So he's saying we need that power for unlimited bailouts no matter what. Now, Matt Stoller, who writes often, and we cover him often, he writes on monopolies. And he has an interesting take on what this op-ed that Timothy Geithner, Ben Bernanke, and Hank Paulson wrote. And he says, the basic lie of Geithner, Paulson, Bernanke is the argument that now regulators have no bailout authority. Leave aside the various misleading elements here. Yes, they do. They just have to ask Congress, which is the most democratic branch of government. They are arguing against democracy. They are angry the people have some formal check on their right to do whatever they want during a crisis. They are couching this in terms of the need to stem panics. They are pretending an attack on democracy is a technical point. It is not. So what they were arguing, they were using the pages of the New York Times op-ed to argue that, we have too much democracy. We shouldn't allow the people to have any say in the unlimited bailout of banks in the next crisis.
No. Okay, what Bernanke, Geithner, and who's the third clown there?
Bernanke, Geithner, and Paulson.
And Paulson, Hank Paulson, who
warned all his friends at Goldman Sachs, I might add.
Who went before Congress and shook down and it's crashed the market.
The TARP,
This is an admission of guilt. This op-ed piece in the New York op-ed piece. They're saying the crisis, we're guilty. We had no constraint, and we printed $17 trillion of bogus claims that are unbacked. We just printed them out of thin air. There's nothing to back them, to bail out our friends. Mm-hmm. That's an admission of guilt. If they're not prosecuted now, after admitting the crime, if I go into the court and I say, guess what, I murdered somebody, and the court says, go away. Murder's not a crime anymore. Okay, so Geithner and Paulson and Bernanke, they think of all the hardship, think of the poverty, think of the opiate crisis because the people have lost their homes, people dying in the street, shooting up. Those guys put the needle in their arm and they killed those people. And they admitted it in the New York Times. And now there's no prosecution, there's no rule of law. There's no law in this country, this America. There's no rule of law.
Okay, so let's...
You can get away with murder.
He concludes on this Twitter stream that there are many ways to do bailouts, but the Obama bailout did not stop a depression. It stopped a new deal. And that's what Bernanke, Geithner, and Paulson are after. That's what they got. We needed to stem the panic. We did not need to rob the middle class to reward their cronies. So as you're saying, this is his way of saying what you're saying, is that they did rob the middle class, and Timothy Geithner and Paulson and Bernanke are saying that they saved the system. Well, there are many ways to save the system. There are ways to do the bailout. This should be discussed and said, like all our public discussions are nonsense. It's about
the way to save the system is for other countries to get out of the dollar.
Okay,
let the dollar collapse.
They're citizens of America, and we are in D.C.
Gone.
Okay, so let's
They're
move on.
expendable.
Let's move
They're
on to the
expendable.
next headline, which
Gone.
is about J.P. Morgan, the biggest bank in America, and they also received the biggest bailout because they were the biggest bank in America with the biggest derivatives book. J.P. Morgan is thinking pitchforks and Fed stock buying in the next financial crash. So if you thought the U.S. outlook could not get any more dystopian, think again. JP Morgan Chase issued a report earlier this week to mark the 10th anniversary of the 2008 Wall Street crash and provide its outlook for what's ahead. JP Morgan suggests that the next financial crash may be so cataclysmic that the Federal Reserve may have to enter the market to buy up stocks, something which the central bank has never done before in the U.S., or at least acknowledged doing, because stock ownership is heavily skewed to the 1%. JP Morgan then goes on to write that this may be controversial in light of the potential impact of central bank actions in driving inequality between assets, owners, and labor. So we've seen for the past 10 years, wealth and income gap has skyrocketed in America based on the bailout that Timothy Geithner, Hank Paulson, and Ben Bernanke were allowed to orchestrate and conduct. It was a panic situation. So in panic and crises moods and disaster capitalism, they're able to move without any discussion. There was never a discussion to bail out all the mortgage holders, to keep those mortgage holders in their home. Over 1 million Americans lost their homes, and the bankers were bailed out. So now we're already seeing that the op-ed in the New York Times, there's no, somebody from Occupy Wall Street is not able to have a counter op-ed in the New York Times saying, dudes, let's let them fail this time. And because if we're having another crisis, it means that...
No. Jamie Dimon is saying that there's another crisis coming.
Yes.
And he's putting a gun to the White House head and saying, you have to buy our stock to preserve my bonus because I'm Jamie Dimon and I'm a king and you're just plebs. You're the serfs. You're the scum. He's saying, America, buy my stock. I'm Jamie Dimon. Okay, he's saying that right now. He's preloading his crime.
He's preloading his crime. And this is them. I'm going to read you.
And he's getting away with it.
I'm going to read you the actual words written by JP Morgan right here. These are the words of JP Morgan. The next crisis is also likely to result in social tensions similar to those witnessed 50 years ago in 1968. In 1968, TV and investigative journalism provided a generation of baby boomers access to unfiltered information on social developments such as Vietnam and other proxy wars, civil rights movements, income inequality, etc. Similar to 1968, the internet today, social media, leaked documents, Keiser report, they don't write that, but I add that, provides millennials with unrestricted access to information on a surprisingly similar range of issues. So they're saying that the internet may make it the next financial crisis, and when the U.S. Federal Reserve and Congress comes to our rescue again and even starts buying our stock so that we're always made whole, the internet, basically they're suggesting the internet should be monitored, that maybe Twitter might be dangerous in this situation if people can speak, if people can gather, if people can know the truth about what's happening.
Right, exactly. So 1968 was a seminal year.
Yes,
but the people won't rise up again.
Well, we'll see.
Because they're on heroin. Hey, we got to take a break, but when we come back, more fun. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Ken Silverstein. He's the founder, editor, and CEO of WashingtonBabylon.com, contributing editor of Vice and Washington Babylon columnist at The Observer. Ken, great to have you on.
Thank you.
All right, now, the reason we have you on, Ken, is because in 2011, you wrote a piece for Salon.com about the neocons pushing for a new Cold War, and it's getting a lot of attention today. It looks like it was wonderfully prescient. Now, those neocons of 2011 have got their Cold War 2.0, and so talk about that a little bit. Get going.
Well, I mean, this is really a continuation of more than a half century of an aggressive American foreign policy. We always need an enemy for a variety of reasons. One is because of the enormous influence of the military-industrial complex, which is, let's face it. I mean, if there's a war, they make bucks. And there is also a foreign policy establishment that deeply, deeply believes in the idea of American exceptionalism, which I find an extraordinarily offensive idea. The idea that this country has some principle, some standing, some stature that is greater than any other country on the planet. Of course, it's what every empire in history has promoted as its ideology, that we are the, rulers because we are the best. And so you have this belief in the right of the United States to dominate the world financially and militarily, if necessary. It's great. I mean, it's been great. It seems to me that this system is petering out. I mean, we are reaching the end of the American century very clearly. But, it's benefited in some ways U.S. citizens because our wealth is in some way very much derived from the control we exert over other parts of the world.
Certainly in the oil industry, we keep gas cheap with our invasions of Iraq and all these other countries and controlling that whole market.
Right.
I get that there's a military-industrial complex. I get that the war is America's #1 industry, and I get that we make a lot of money selling arms and promoting war. Walk me through, though, because, your piece really kind of predicted the Cold War 2.0, because at the time it seemed like Russia was not going to be a threat at all. That the collapse of 1989 period, 1990, the U.S. basically meddled in the elections over there. They put Boris Yeltsin in under Clinton, who called him his guy in Washington. The Time magazine ran a cover story bragging about how they manipulated this election in now what was the Russia. And but it appeared as though there weren't going to be much of a threat there. But when did this new Cold War thing kick in? Was it, I can think of a couple of points that kind of jogged people into thinking like this, but what was the crystal point that was like, aha, it's back to Cold War, it's back to Russia as the enemy, Ken?
Boy, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can pinpoint that moment. I mean, I do believe that as a necessary component of foreign policy, the United States seeks to it needs enemies, to put it simply. I mean, in order to justify the insane military budget and various insane, in my view, and certainly not very successful foreign policy adventures, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, which we are deeply involved in, on and on and on.
Let me ask you this. You got a guy named Bill Kristol, right? Now, it wasn't too long ago that the liberals in America were talking about Bloody Bill Kristol, neocon. He's a guy, he's a warmonger. And now he's being lauded by the left. He goes on Rachel Maddow and these shows, and he's considered to be a hero amongst... what do you make of that?
It's an astonishing fact. I mean, Kristol was one of the leading proponents of the Iraq War. Everything he and his neocon colleagues who promoted that war, everything they predicted was catastrophically wrong. I mean, this has to rank as one of the worst foreign policy adventures, for lack of a better term, in American history. The idea that this guy is now even, I mean, he shouldn't be allowed on TV. I mean, the guy has, it's not an exaggeration to say he has blood on his hands as one of the primary architects of that war. A lot of blood.
But how facile can Rachel Maddow be? How can she go from make this 180-degree turn? And now, is it pure venality? Is it just she's purely corrupt and has no integrity whatsoever, and we shouldn't expect that in American media anymore?
Well, we definitely shouldn't expect it in American media anymore. I mean, if we, over the last few years, we've watched this absolute degradation over the last 20 years, but over the last few years in particular. But no, this part is easy to explain. It's Trump derangement syndrome. Bill Kristol and a lot of other people who liberals and even some lefties would normally shun in disgust. People like James Clapper, Brennan. I mean, these former senior intelligence officials who were deeply implicated in the catastrophic and immoral war on terror, quotes, let me put that in quotes, and some really hideous policies, NSA surveillance, torture. These people have been rehabilitated because in the eyes of the, quote, resistance, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there is a desperate effort to bring down Trump. However it's done. I mean, there's an attempt to get him out of office, whether it's impeachment or forcing him to resign or Mueller setting a perjury trap for him, which I have to frankly say, that's a real risk because Trump has a very difficult time telling the truth. But the fact is, this whole scandal originated from a fraudulent narrative, which was that in my view, fraudulent, that the Trump campaign openly and actively colluded with Vladimir Putin. That has never been proven. I don't think it is ever going to be proven because I think it is false. But because of this hysteria and obsession with removing Donald Trump from office, all of these people have been rehabilitated and dredged up again as foreign policy experts, even though a guy like Crystal has, I can't think of a figure in recent American times who has been wrong so often and so catastrophically wrong with such utterly horrible consequences. I do want to say that I am not a fan of Vladimir Putin. This is in no way, this is the danger we are in now in this ideologically terrible, dangerous time of narrow thinking. People are incapable of holding two thoughts in their head at the same time. I believe that Donald Trump, I am not a fan of Trump's. I oppose many of his policies. I find them abhorrent. I mean, his policies on immigration to me are absolutely horrifying. The tax cuts, I oppose. Whatever. You can't impeach a president because you don't like him. I mean, the right wing tried to do that with Obama, and now the lefty, well, I wouldn't even say left, the sort of liberal spectrum of American politics. This is Trump is a guy they're not comfortable with. I understand that in a sense. He's not a member of the club. They don't like him. Hillary Clinton would have been a better steward of capital. And they tried to stop him from becoming president, and since then they tried to block him from taking office. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say. I know for a fact that immediately after the election, a group of very, very wealthy donors got together, Democratic donors got together and conspired to come up with a plan to either block Trump from taking office or to impeach him.
Let me ask you this about Trump. Would it be fair to say, in your observation, that Donald Trump has a worldview that skews toward peace? And then talk a little bit about that, because my question is that it seems that they're not really against Trump, is that they're against peace.
I don't entirely agree with you there. I understand your perspective. I believe that Trump has views that are very unpopular and run fundamentally opposed to mainstream American foreign policy views. He's anti-NATO. He's expressed views on NATO that are very, very scary to the foreign policy consensus.
We'll dig into NATO here for a second, because the mandate for NATO, of course, was not to push east.
Yeah.
And sit on the border of Russia.
Right.
And I think Russia, rightfully, is quite nervous about that, because even during the World War II, they didn't have Germans, parked up right on their frickin' border.
Yeah.
Berlin was quite a ways away. This is not, obviously, if Russia parked a bunch of tanks on the Mexico-U.S. border or the Canadian-U.S. border, I'm sure Americans, that's rightfully would be upset, right?
Would be upset, and not only that, the media would be outraged about the appalling actions of Russia, the war provocation.
So NATO is completely disenfranchised itself. It's just it has overstepped the bounds of what it was created for. It's really hard to understand why they even exist at this point.
It exists for one simple reason. It's a racketeering operation to continue to sell American weapons abroad. It is a useless organization. It should have been disbanded.
Okay.
NATO.
Put in that for a second, Ken. We're just talking about NATO. You're saying that Trump's view on NATO is that, if I may say, from my understanding, is that it's bloated, unneeded, archaic institution that we can reform or get rid of, right? So you're kind of are you agreeing with that or not?
I agree with that. I think Trump is being moved in very different directions by various factions within his administration. And so I don't, and that is why I would not say that I believe he is a man of peace. I think that, I do believe that the quote resistance, the Rachel Maddows, this broad, I mean, everybody from John McCain became a resistance warrior. I mean, for God's sake.
And clearly John McCain is a man of war.
He was. There's no question about it.
Bomb Iran.
Yeah, you could
Every word out of his mouth was bomb, war, kill. That was John McCain.
On foreign policy, the man was a monster. There's no question about it. And the fact that he died should not make us create some mythology about him. But in any event, I do believe...
Can you hang on for a second segment?
Yeah.
Okay, we're just getting good.
Okay.
We're going to continue it. But we got to say goodbye for now, and we'll talk again in another segment. But thanks for being on this segment.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Ken Silverstein, founder, editor-chief of the WashingtonBabylon.com. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.